North Cascade Foothills, Washington Territory, autumn 1888. When Alexei Volkov began building his second wall, the one on the inside, his neighbors were certain he had finally succumbed to the isolation of the deep woods. They watched from the muddy track that served as a road as he hewed logs that were too thin for a proper outer wall, let alone an entire second structure just inside the first. He was leaving a gap between the two walls, a space so wide a child could nearly walk through it. It was a monumental waste of timber, a waste of time, and a clear sign that the quiet man from the Russian Empire had a mind as unsettled as the mists that shrouded the valley. The other settlers, men who had built their own cabins with sweat and conventional wisdom, would stop and stare. They saw a man building a wooden box inside another wooden box, leaving a useless, empty void between them. He was not just building a home, he was building a monument to foolishness. What did this quiet, observant shipwright, a man more familiar with the Baltic Sea than the Cascade forests, understand about staying warm that they, the seasoned pioneers of this wet, cold wilderness, had all missed? Before we unpack the secrets of Alexei's strange and ridiculed design, a design that would be tested in the crucible of a legendary winter, take a moment to support our exploration of forgotten history. Please click the like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories of practical genius. And in the comments below, let us know what city or region you're watching from and what the winters are like there. We are about to reveal a principle of thermal dynamics that was understood by instinct long before it was defined by science. To understand the madness of Alexei's method, you must first understand the misery of a standard frontier cabin in the Pacific Northwest. This was not the dry, crisp cold of the high plains or the Rocky Mountains. This was a different beast entirely. It was a damp, penetrating cold that clung to everything. The air, heavy with moisture from relentless autumn rains and winter snows, seemed to possess a physical weight, a thermal appetite that no amount of fire could ever fully satisfy. A typical cabin was built from the largest logs a man and his oxen could manage. The gaps were chinked with a mixture of mud, clay, and dried grass. In theory, this created a solid, impenetrable barrier against the elements. In practice, it was a constant, losing battle against water. The rain would saturate the mud, chinking, turning it into a weeping slurry that invited dampness directly into the living space. The wood itself, often felled green and used immediately, was a sponge. A full seasoned log was a luxury few could afford to wait for. Inside these cabins, life was a cycle of damp and smoke. The single large fireplace or stove, usually built of river stone and clay, was the heart of the home, but it was a temperamental one. To combat the oppressive cold, fires had to be kept roaring at all times. This consumed a staggering amount of firewood, often more than a cord every few weeks. The demand for fuel was so great that men were forced to fell, split, and haul wood even in the worst of weather, burning green, wet logs that hissed and smoked more than they burned. The cabins were filled with a perpetual haze that stung the eyes and coated every surface with a fine layer of soot. Warmth was a localized phenomenon. You could be sweating if you stood 2 feet from the stove, yet feel a bone-chilling draft on your back. The walls themselves were cold to the touch, radiating the exterior temperature inward. Frost would form on the inside of the cabin, tracing the patterns of the chinking where the cold found its easiest path. Bedding was perpetually damp. Leather goods grew mold. The floor, often little more than packed earth or rough-hewn puncheons laid directly on the damp ground, was a slab of near-frozen misery. Children were warned not to play on it, and illness from persistent coughs to life-threatening pneumonia was a constant shadow in every household. This was the accepted reality. It was the price of admission for a life in the green, formidable wilderness of the Washington Territory. Alexei Volkov knew a different kind of cold and a different kind of damp. He was born near Riga, in what was then the Russian province of Livonia, a city on the Baltic Sea. He had not been a farmer or a logger, but a shipwright. For 20 years, his world had been the anatomy of wooden vessels designed to withstand the brutal North Atlantic. He understood in his bones the relationship between wood and water. He knew that a ship's greatest enemy was not the sea itself, but the slow, insidious rot that began from trapped moisture within its own structure. He had seen firsthand how a double-hulled design with an air gap between the inner and outer planking not only added strength, but also helped to manage condensation and moisture. He had learned the unique properties of different materials used for insulation and sealing. He had spent years observing how temperature differences between the cold sea and the warmer interior of a ship created a constant dew of condensation on the inside of the hull. On a ship, this moisture could be managed, channeled into the bilge and pumped away. In a cabin, it simply soaked into the walls, the bedding, and the lungs of the people inside. When Alexei arrived in the valley with his wife Marta and their 2 young sons, he did not see forests of timber. He saw a problem he had spent his entire life solving, just on a different scale. He listened quietly at the general store as men complained about the endless damp, the insatiable appetite of their stoves, and the sickness that settled in their chests each winter. They spoke of thicker logs and better mud for their chinking. They were trying to fight the cold and damp with brute force. Alexei knew you could not defeat the damp. You had to give it a path. You had to manage it. So in the late summer of 1888, he began his strange project. He felled cedar trees, but instead of seeking out the largest trunks, he chose smaller, more uniform logs. He laid his foundation, a raised sill of massive, rot-resistant old-growth cedar, elevated a full 2 feet off the ground on stone piers. This alone was unusual. Most cabins were built low to the ground to conserve heat. Alexei was inviting the cold air to circulate underneath his entire home. The other settlers shook their heads. Then came the walls. He erected his outer wall first. The logs were a modest 10 inches in diameter, carefully notched and fitted. The gaps were minimal. It looked like a small, but otherwise normal, cabin. But he did not chink it. He left the small gaps between the logs open. Then he began building the second wall inside the first. This inner wall was made of even smaller logs, only about 6 inches in diameter. He constructed it parallel to the outer wall, maintaining a consistent, deliberate gap between the 2 structures. The gap was 18 inches wide, an enormous, seemingly useless void. This was the point where curiosity turned to open ridicule. The space he was sacrificing was significant. In a modest 20 by 30 foot cabin, that 18-inch gap on all 4 sides represented a loss of over 150 square feet of living space. It was the size of an entire small room, given over to nothing. It was also, by their calculation, a colossal waste of wood and labor. He was effectively building 2 cabins, one inside the other. But the strangest part was yet to come. While the other men in the valley were preparing their firewood for the winter, Alexei and his family spent weeks in the high, boggy meadows. They were not cutting wood. They were harvesting moss. Specifically, they were gathering huge quantities of sphagnum moss, the light, stringy, pale green moss that formed immense carpets in the wetlands. They gathered it in burlap sacks, hauled it down to their building site, and laid it out on vast canvases to dry in the late summer sun. For weeks, his plot of land looked like a textile operation, covered in acres of drying, curing moss. Once the moss was bone-dry and fluffy, the true purpose of his design was revealed. Alexei began to meticulously pack the 18-inch cavity between his inner and outer walls. He packed it from the foundation sill all the way to the roofline. He used long poles to tamp it down, ensuring a firm but not overly compressed fill. He was not just filling a gap, he was creating a massive, continuous layer of insulation. He was wrapping his living space in a thick blanket of dried moss. When he was finished, the cabin appeared to have walls that were nearly 3 feet thick, but everyone knew the truth. It was 2 thin skins of wood filled with worthless swamp grass. Let's pause to examine the scientific principles at play here, principles that Alexei Volkov understood intuitively. He was creating a multi-layered defense system against the cold, with each layer serving a distinct purpose. The first layer was the elevated foundation. By raising the cabin 2 feet off the ground, he created a ventilated crawl space. This prevented ground moisture from wicking up into the floor joists and the logs of the first wall, a primary source of dampness and rot in conventional cabins. It kept the base of his structure dry. The second element was the outer wall with its unchinked gaps. This was not meant to be an airtight barrier. It was a screen. It was designed to break the force of the wind and shed the vast majority of the rain, but the small gaps allowed the entire structure to breathe. Any moisture that penetrated the outer logs or was driven into the moss-filled cavity would encounter a constant slow air exchange with the outside, allowing it to dry out rather than become trapped. This was his version of a ship's ventilated hull. He was preventing the buildup of interstitial condensation, the hidden enemy that rotted houses from the inside out. The core of the innovation was the 18-inch cavity filled with dried sphagnum moss. This was the insulation layer. Modern science quantifies the effectiveness of insulation using an R-value, a measure of thermal resistance. A solid 12-inch thick log of softwood, like the cedar Alexei used, has an R-value of approximately 15. This is decent, but not spectacular. The real problem is the chinking between the logs, which often has an R-value close to 0, creating thermal bridges that bleed heat. Alexei's system was entirely different. Dried sphagnum moss, when packed to the density he was using, has an R value of approximately 3.5 per inch. By filling an 18-inch cavity, he was creating an insulation blanket with a staggering R value of 63. This was more than 4 times the insulating value of a solid log wall of the same thickness. He had essentially wrapped his home in the equivalent of a modern, high-performance, structural insulated panel. Furthermore, sphagnum moss has unique properties. It is highly hygroscopic, meaning it can absorb a great deal of water, up to 20 times its own weight. But critically, it is also antiseptic and does not readily decompose. Unlike hay or grass, which would rot into a sludgy mess, the sphagnum would act as a moisture buffer. Any dampness that found its way into the wall cavity would be absorbed by the moss and then slowly released as vapor, which would then escape through the ventilated outer wall. It was a breathable, high-performance insulation system built entirely from materials found within a mile of his home. The final piece was the 6-inch inner wall. Its purpose was structural, to hold the moss in place, and thermal. It provided the final barrier, its inner surface remaining warm and dry, completely isolated from the cold and damp present in the outer layers of the system. This, of course, was not how his neighbors saw it. The most vocal of his critics was a man named Elias Thorne. Thorne was a second-generation settler, a carpenter and builder who had erected more than half the structures in the valley. He was a respected, no-nonsense man whose opinions carried weight. He saw Alexei's project not just as foolish, but as dangerously misguided. One afternoon, he strode over to Alexei's building site, his boots sinking into the wood chips and moss debris. "Volkov," he began, his voice not unkind but firm, like a teacher correcting a student. "I have been quiet long enough. You need to stop this." Alexei paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand. He simply looked at Thorne, waiting. "You are building a trap," Thorne explained, gesturing at the half-filled wall cavity. "That moss will soak up the winter rain like a sponge. It will never dry out. By midwinter, you'll have a wall of solid ice between your logs. Or worse, it will turn to rot, and the damp will eat your inner wall until the whole thing collapses on your family." He stepped closer and pointed to the unchinked outer logs. "And these gaps, you're inviting the wind inside your walls. You haven't built a blanket, you've built a chimney. All your heat will go straight up and out through the roof. You're wasting good timber on a foolish experiment." Alexei listened patiently, his gaze steady. He had heard these arguments before in whispers and jeers from others. He considered Thorne's words, which were logical based on conventional thinking. "Perhaps," Alexei said, his voice quiet, with the lilting accent of his homeland. "We will see come January." Thorne snorted, a sound of pure exasperation. He turned and walked away, shaking his head. The verdict was in. The community's leading expert had declared the project a failure before it was even complete. The ridicule intensified. At the general store, it became a running joke. Men would ask the proprietor for a pound of Volkov's wall stuffing when they bought their tobacco. They called the structure Volkov's Folly, or the Moss House. They made bets on how long it would take for him to admit his mistake and tear down the inner wall, or how many cords of wood he would burn trying to heat the empty space he had built. The social pressure was immense, and it fell most heavily on Alexei's wife, Marta. She trusted her husband's skill. She had seen the magnificent ships he had helped build, vessels that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. But they were far from the sea now. Here, in this isolated valley, the judgment of their neighbors was a powerful force. She felt their stares when she went to the store for flour and salt. She heard the whispers. One evening, as Alexei sat by the fire in their temporary shelter, sharpening his tools, she finally voiced her fear. "Alexei," she said softly, her hands twisting in her apron, "Mr. Thorne, he says the walls will rot. He says the children will be colder in this new house than we are in this lean-to. Are you sure? The boys, their coughs are already bad." Alexei put down his whetstone and looked at his wife. He saw the genuine fear in her eyes, a fear born not of disbelief in him, but of the overwhelming consensus of the world around them. He reached out and took her hand. "Marta," he said, his voice full of a confidence he rarely showed, "on a ship, we build to keep the water out, but we also build to let the water that gets in escape. A house is the same. Their houses are sealed tight, but they are wet inside. Our house will breathe. The moss is a lung. It will keep the damp away from us. You will be warm. The boys will play on the floor in the middle of winter. I promise you this." She held his gaze, searching his face, and found not a hint of doubt. She nodded, her fear receding, replaced by a fragile trust in the man she had followed across a continent. The cabin was finished in late October, just as the first cold rains began to fall. The family moved in. From the outside, it looked stout but unremarkable, save for the unusual thickness of its walls. Inside, the air was clean and dry, free of the smoky haze that plagued their neighbors. But the real test was yet to come. Before we witness the brutal winter that put Alexei's innovation to the ultimate test, if you're finding this story of unconventional wisdom compelling, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. It helps us bring more of these forgotten histories to light. Now, let us know in the comments, what is the coldest temperature you have ever personally experienced? The numbers you are about to hear will likely put that to the test. The winter of 1888 to 1889 arrived not as a gradual slide into cold, but as a sudden, violent assault. The locals would later call it the Great Freeze. It began in late December with a week of heavy, wet snow that bent trees to the breaking point. Then, the skies cleared and the temperature plummeted. A mass of Arctic air, a polar vortex, descended from the north and settled over the Pacific Northwest. For 23 consecutive days, the temperature in the valley never rose above 0 degrees Fahrenheit. For the settlers in their conventional cabins, life became a grim battle for survival. The dampness that had been a mere nuisance was now a mortal enemy. The moisture trapped in their chinking and logs froze solid, turning their walls into structures of ice-laced wood that conducted the cold with brutal efficiency. The interior surfaces of their cabins, even inches from a roaring fire, were coated in a thick layer of white frost. Water buckets left by the door froze solid in under an hour. The demand for firewood became desperate. Men who had budgeted a cord of wood for a month found themselves burning through it in a week. They were forced out into the sub-zero temperatures to cut more, their axes ringing against wood frozen as hard as iron. Their hands and feet, wrapped in inadequate leather and wool, were blackened with frostbite. The green wood they were forced to burn produced more smoke than heat, filling their poorly ventilated cabins with an acrid, blinding smog. Sickness spread like wildfire. The constant cold, the damp air, and the smoke weakened every man, woman, and child. Pneumonia, which had been a shadow, became a reaper. Inside Elias Thorne's cabin, a structure he had built himself and considered the pinnacle of frontier design, the misery was palpable. Despite having one of the largest stone fireplaces in the valley and a new cast-iron stove, the temperature away from the hearth hovered at a miserable 38 degrees. His wife and children huddled together under a mountain of quilts and animal pelts, their breath pluming in the air. The windows were opaque with ice an inch thick. Every morning, Thorne would spend an hour with a mallet and chisel, breaking the ice that had sealed his own front door shut from the inside. He burned wood at a rate that terrified him, watching his carefully stacked winter supply vanish before his eyes. This was survival, but it was not life. One evening, during the second week of the freeze, the wind picked up, howling down from the mountain passes at over 60 miles per hour. The wind chill dropped to an unimaginable 60 degrees below zero. It was on this night that the cabin of the Jensen family, situated half a mile from Alexei Volkov, reached its breaking point. A gust of wind found a weakness in their clay and stone chimney, and a section of it collapsed, filling the cabin with thick, choking smoke and rendering their fireplace useless. With no heat, their cabin would become a tomb in a matter of hours. In desperation, Lars Jensen gathered his wife and his feverish young daughter and stumbled through the gale-force winds and deep snow toward their nearest neighbor, the strange man in the moss house. He had laughed at Volkov's folly, along with everyone else, but it was his only hope. He hammered on the thick wooden door, his knuckles numb, expecting to find a family as miserable as his own, if not more so. The door swung open, and Lars Jensen stumbled inside, out of the shrieking wind, and he stopped, utterly bewildered. The air inside was not cold. It was warm, It was not just warm, it was comfortable. Alexei Volkov stood before him, wearing a simple wool shirt, not the multiple layers of heavy coats everyone else wore indoors. His wife Marta was at a table, mending clothes, her hands nimble and bare. And on the floor, on a simple rag rug, his 2 young sons were quietly playing with carved wooden toys. They were in their stocking feet. There was no roaring fire. A small, efficient-looking stove in the center of the room glowed with a gentle heat, consuming a single, small log. There was no smoke in the air. There was no frost on the walls. Jensen reached out a trembling, gloveless hand and touched the inner log wall. It was cool, but it was not cold. It felt like wood, not a block of ice. The air smelled clean, of cedar and drying herbs, not damp wool and soot. It was an oasis of impossible warmth and dryness in the heart of a frozen hell. "My chimney, it collapsed," Jensen stammered, his eyes wide with disbelief. "My daughter, she's sick." Alexei and Marta rushed to help, taking the shivering child and wrapping her in a warm, dry blanket. They sat the family down, giving them hot tea. As Lars Jensen sat there, the feeling slowly returning to his frozen limbs, he could not reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew to be possible. He was sitting in a cabin in the middle of a historic blizzard at nearly 20 degrees below zero outside, and he was comfortable in a single shirt. The children were playing on the floor. It defied all logic. The news spread, carried on the wind itself. Lars Jensen's family had taken refuge at Volkov's place. They were warm. They were safe. The story seemed too fantastic to be true. It was this rumor that finally reached Elias Thorne. He was a proud man, but he was also a practical one. He was a builder. He dealt in facts, in wood and stone, and the physical laws that governed them. What he was hearing about the Moss House violated those laws as he understood them. He needed to see for himself. He owned one of the few truly accurate thermometers in the valley, a mercury instrument from Boston that he kept for brewing and for his own scientific curiosity. The next afternoon, with the outside temperature holding at a steady 18 degrees below zero, he wrapped himself in his heaviest coat, took his thermometer, and made the trek to Volkov's Folly. He was not going to mock or to gloat. He was going to investigate. He was going to get data. He knocked on the door, and when Alexei opened it, Thorne did not ask to come in. He simply stated his purpose. "Volkov, they say you are warm in here. I want to take a measurement." Alexei nodded and stepped aside. Thorne entered, and like Jensen before him, he was immediately struck by the profound difference in the environment. He unbuttoned his heavy coat, feeling sweat begin to prickle on his brow. He looked at his own thermometer. The mercury, which had been sitting at the bottom of the tube at -18, began to climb. It rose past zero. It rose past 20, past 40, past 60. It finally settled at a steady 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68 degrees. Thorne stood in stunned silence. He walked over to the inner wall and placed the bulb of the thermometer against the wood. After a few minutes, he checked it. 64 degrees. The wall itself was only 4 degrees cooler than the ambient air in the room. He then went to his own home later that day and performed the same measurement. With the outside temperature at -20, the air inside his cabin, 3 feet from the stove, was 42 degrees. The inner surface of his thick, solid log wall was 28 degrees. It was actively leaching heat out of his home. The difference was staggering. Alexei's cabin was maintaining a temperature differential of 86 degrees between the inside and the outside. Thorne's cabin was struggling to maintain a differential of 62 degrees, and it was doing so while consuming, by his own estimation, at least 3 times as much firewood. Thorne asked Alexei how much wood he had burned since the freeze began. Alexei pointed to a small pile of logs in the corner. It was less than a quarter of a cord. Thorn had burned through nearly a full cord and a half in the same period. The hard numbers laid the truth bare. It was not magic. It was engineering. The data was undeniable, measured by his own instrument, verified by his own eyes. The wasted space, the swamp moss, the foolish-looking gaps in the outer wall, it all worked. It worked better than anything he had ever built, better than anything he had ever imagined. Elias Thorn was a man whose reputation was built on being right. He was the expert, the voice of tradition and proven methods. In that moment, standing in the impossible warmth of the Moss House, he was faced with a choice. He could retreat into denial, find excuses, or attack the evidence, or he could do the harder thing. He walked back to the center of the room where Alexei stood quietly waiting. Thorn looked the smaller man in the eye. He took a deep breath, the warm, clean air a stark contrast to the thin, icy air in his own home. He was a carpenter, a man who respected true things, and this was a true thing. "I was wrong," Thorn said, his voice clear and steady, devoid of any resentment. "I was simply completely wrong. This works." It was a confession, an absolution, and a surrender all in one. Alexei Volkov simply nodded again. There was no triumph in his eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." There was only the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman whose work had proven itself. The vindication was not in Thorn's words, but in the sight of his own children playing, healthy and warm, on the floor of their home. The Great Freeze of 1889 broke a week later. As the valley thawed and life returned to a semblance of normalcy, the story of Volkov's folly, now whispered with a tone of awe, became legend. The name itself changed. It was no longer a folly. Some began to call it the Volkov Wall, and later, as the technique was adopted and adapted, it became known as cascade walling. Elias Thorn became the innovation's most vocal champion. Having been its greatest skeptic, his conversion gave the method an undeniable credibility. That spring, he approached Alexei not as a critic, but as a student. He spent weeks learning the nuances of the design, the importance of the raised foundation, the precise size of the ventilation gaps in the outer wall, the art of drying and packing the sphagnum moss to the perfect density. The following summer, 3 new cabins were built in the valley using the cascade walling method, one of them by Thorn himself. When the next winter came, a normal winter of moderate cold and damp, the results were just as convincing. The families in the new houses were warmer, drier, and healthier. They burned less than half the firewood of their neighbors. The economic impact was immediate and profound. Less time spent cutting wood meant more time for trapping, for clearing land, for improving their homesteads. It was a direct increase in productivity and wealth. The long-term impact on health was even more significant. The persistent coughs and lung ailments that had plagued the valley's children began to fade in the homes that adopted the new design. The dry, warm environment prevented the growth of mold and mildew, dramatically improving indoor air quality. It was a fundamental increase in the quality of life, a raising of human dignity from a grim struggle for survival to a state of comfortable habitation. The innovation spread beyond the small valley. Loggers and trappers who passed through saw the design, heard the stories, and took the principles with them. The method was adapted, using sawdust or wood shavings where sphagnum moss was not available. The core principle, a ventilated outer screen, a thick cavity of insulation, and an airtight inner wall, became a new standard for high-quality construction in the wet climate of the coastal Northwest. Alexei Volkov's quiet, observant wisdom had permanently altered the architectural DNA of the region. What Alexei had built was, in essence, a pioneering version of several modern high-performance building techniques. His unchinked outer wall was a primitive but effective rain screen, a feature now common in modern architecture in wet climates to manage moisture. His moss-filled cavity was a super-insulated double-stud wall, a design used today in passive houses and energy-efficient construction to achieve extremely high R values. He had created a breathable, thermally broken wall assembly decades before the scientific vocabulary to describe it even existed. His intuitive understanding of thermal dynamics and moisture management, born from his experience as a shipwright, was simply ahead of its time. The story of Alexei Volkov and his moss house is a powerful reminder that innovation often comes from the outside. It is a testament to the wisdom of questioning convention, of observing a problem with fresh eyes, and of trusting empirical results over established dogma. Elias Thorne's journey is equally important. It highlights the integrity required to admit error in the face of undeniable evidence, a humility that is the true partner of wisdom. The expert who cannot learn is no expert at all. True mastery lies not in always being right, but in the relentless pursuit of what works. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of practical genius and quiet vindication valuable, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel for more content that uncovers the forgotten lessons of history. As a final thought, we'd like to ask you, if you were a settler in that valley having seen the proof, would you have torn down your old cabin to build a new one with Alexei's method? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Our next video will explore the fascinating story of the self-ventilating food cellars of the Azorean immigrants, a brilliant low-tech solution to food preservation that allowed them to thrive where others failed. You will not want to miss it. Please be advised that the content of this video is for historical, educational, and entertainment purposes only. The construction techniques depicted are historical and may not meet modern building codes, safety standards, or engineering requirements. Any construction project, historical or modern, should be undertaken only with professional guidance and in full compliance with all local laws, codes, and regulations. Do not attempt to replicate historical building methods without consulting qualified architects and engineers.